Really critical to this process is this next step. And Don Smith has been gracious in being a sponsor, in providing his personal leadership in the steering committee to make this day happen, has incredible experience from being the person who led the fixing of the Hyperion treatment plant and fixing Santa Monica Bay in a huge way, leaving us to new problems like stormwater runoff. But introducing Don briefly, he's vice chairman of MWH, supervises key global client relationships, and directs specific company growth initiatives, including mergers and acquisitions. A 31-year veteran of the firm, he held numerous senior executive positions at MWH and will continue to lead the implementation of the company's growth strategy. Previously, Mr. Smith has been president of MWH Americas, chief operating officer of U.S. Municipal Operations, chief marketing officer of Municipal Services, and program manager of UK's Northwest Water AMP3 program. In recent years, he served as chief of strategy implementation. He's been through the mill. Mr. Smith is one of MWH's most seasoned experts in the areas of utility-wide wastewater planning and strategy development. He continues to maintain executive-level relationships with key clients, including LA, San Diego, Atlanta, Houston, New York, Singapore, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, which is why I want to work for him. He holds a master's and BA from California Institute of Technology, Caltech. He also holds professional engineering registration, along with having attended Harvard Business School Advanced Management Program, and has been a member of MWH Global Inc. Board of Directors for 8 consecutive years. Welcome, Don.
Thank you, Andy. You now know why we need a microphone, because if I didn't have a microphone, you would not be able to hear me. As I listened to Patrick talk, and my friend Paul Brown foreshadow some of my comments with his comments about Australia, I was thinking about my journey to be here. I've been an engineer for 36 years, and I now sort of moved to the status of becoming a recovering engineer, because I think engineers are oftentimes blamed for a lot of the challenges that we've been discussing today. And I actually happen to subscribe to this theory that that's fair and accurate. What I wanted to do today, as we move to where do we need to go, is I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of examples globally and what they might teach us as we try to identify some next steps. But first, I'd like to give my own framework. I felt like Patrick was giving part of my talk this morning when he spoke, probably much more eloquently than I will. But what I'm going to talk about is achieving an integrated, outcome-driven infrastructure policy shift. Is it a cause or is it an effect? Is it top-down or bottom-up? I think a lot of times we wonder. What are the other global models for shifting policy? And I want to talk about the EU and Australia. And really, what are the conclusions and or imperatives for making progress as we go forward? Patrick talked about being simple and simplifying your message, and I always have a feeling that if I conclude that there are more than 3 or 4 or 5 things that are really important, they get lost in the transmission as we communicate them over time. And so what I'm trying to do is not be exhaustive, but representative, and give you my own perspective. A policy framework needs both top-down guidance and bottom-up creativity. And I've shown here a pyramid. Policy at the top, that could be some sort of government, either at a state, federal level, or a local level. Then you've got sectors which might represent transportation, water, energy. And then you have individual projects. And if we look at that, at a policy level, the ideal world, we're creating an integrated philosophy of what are our objectives. and those objectives need to be simple. In the sectors, we're looking for horizontal synergy. Where can we collaborate to achieve more? And at the project, we're looking at really what are the opportunities that this project brings to the table in order to accomplish both the synergies and the objectives. All too often, the alignment vertically doesn't exist, either because objectives have not been identified at a policy level, people have not looked horizontally. We heard about that earlier, particularly in tight budgets, people move internal. And finally, at a project level, there's a problem. I put this another axis on here, which is the degree of difficulty in defining objectives. And I think at a project level, it's fairly easy. I think as you climb that ladder, it's more difficult. Not because the objectives are more difficult, but because the political barriers to achieving them are more difficult. The stakeholder processes are more involved. And I think more importantly, individuals have to put themselves at risk. Either politicians, department leaders, someone has to step out and say, I'm going to try to set these objectives, and they become a target when they do that. So I'd like to spend a moment on the project before I go and talk about the EU and Australia. I have a theory that the first 5% of a project, that decisions can significantly change the direction and add significant value. And you have a typical value curve where in planning you have a large ability to impact the value that's delivered, design less so, construction and operation almost none. At the other end of the spectrum, cost goes up. And so what you see there is in the first part of a project, you can have huge impact. And the difference of doing the job right at the front end is absolutely phenomenal. If we look at that, the first 5% is where expansive scoping questions can be pursued. You get too far down the road, it's not possible. The questions I like to talk about are first, what cross-organizational or sector objectives could this project achieve? And I'm reminded as I reflected on this, Hyperion was mentioned, and I was a little bit involved in the wastewater program in LA back in the late 80s. It was an interesting time. I'm not sure I'd want to go back to those days because they were extraordinarily challenging. But one of the things I think we found when I was running the wastewater program, we were looking at wet weather and dry weather overflows. They were a really big regulatory problem. One of the solutions was the Water Conservation Ordinance. And Public Works and DWP collaborated cross departments to push that forward. DWP doing the heavy lifting of implementation. I think Public Works helped with the sales job at the City Council relative to the need. And it actually worked. But we saw it as an opportunity even though it wasn't in our silo. I think the second question I tend to ask at the beginning of a project is how might major trends affect this project in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years? This gets to the long-term horizon that Patrick was talking about. I think we assume, we make decisions based upon criteria that we see in the rearview mirror. We don't look forward. In our firm recently, probably 3 or 4 years ago, we did a megatrend effort. And at that time, one of the things we postulated was what would happen if we got to $100 barrel oil. People in the firm, when I put that on the table, said, "Are you crazy? That'll never happen." I think those questions have to be put when you're developing major efforts.